Hello, everyone. Welcome to Plenary 1 for the International Chemical and Oil Pollution Conference and Exhibition. My name is Fiona Lowe, and I'll be your host today. Organized by the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore, the biennial event aims to promote Singapore as a center of expertise and knowledge in the prevention and response to oil and chemical spills. This year's ICOPCE is held in conjunction with the International Safety at Sea Week as part of its commitment to promote safety at sea. This year's theme is Embracing a New Era in Marine Environment Protection. We are delighted to have over 900 participants from more than 70 countries joining us, with key decision makers from governments around the world, as well as representatives from across different sectors of the maritime industry. Thank you all for joining us. I would like to begin by introducing our panel for the topic Future-Proofing Marine Environment Protection in a Changing Landscape. The moderator for this session will be Captain Binoy Dubey, Admiralty Manager and Solicitor at Incisive Law LLC. Joining him on the panel, we have Captain Raymond Peter, Managing Director at Bernhard Schulte Ship Management Singapore Private Limited. Mr. Darren Waterman, Regional Director, APAC, Oil Spill Response Limited. And Mr. Bas Weber, General Manager at Resolve Salvage and Fire Asia Private Limited. To kick off today's discussion, Captain Binoy will deliver the keynote presentation on future-proofing marine environment protection in a changing landscape before we proceed with the panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, please note that you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to pose questions to our panelists. And with that, I'd like to hand the time over to our moderator. Captain Dubey, please.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, MPA and ICOPCE for having us over here. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever time zone applicable to you. Welcome to the MPA ICOPCE panel discussion, Plenary 1 session, Future-Proofing Marine Environment Protection in a Changing Landscape. Given the society's zero tolerance to marine spills, this is very important and relevant topic and affecting all of us. This is how we want our marine ecosystem to be. Clean beaches, clean oceans, clean seas, clean ports, and the best scenario is never to have a spill. We have to, however, recognize the facts that the accidents can and they do happen. Although the shipping accidents account for only a small proportion of oil released into the marine environment worldwide, they can result in a sudden escape of sufficient quantity to cause damage because a huge quantity of oil would concentrate in a single location. Also, given the ever-increasing size of the vessel, there is an increasing risk of high consequence events. Add this to increased frequency of extreme weather events, growing use of Arctic routes, wider range of fuels used on board the vessels. The industry may require a very sophisticated incident management system involving international response from government and industry. The challenges are how such responder-dependent response we mobilize during a global pandemic, and therefore a rethink is needed how to conduct an effective response in this situation. And this may have an immediate impact on wildlife, fisheries, coastal and marine habitats. The economic consequences of oil chemical spills are often extensive, particularly for the people who depend on the resources or natural beauty of the area for their livelihood. Say, for example, fishing, aquaculture, tourism, and the related industry. We have a panel of distinguished speakers and they are expert in their own field. What we are going to discuss here, after my short presentation on P&I related claims, we will focus on the panel discussion, and our primary aim is to consider first the COVID-19 pandemic, how the industry has navigated the challenges of the pandemic, how to deal with a marine casualty, and how to overcome barriers to effective response. We will then discuss some broad issues around mega container ship fire, which industry is still struggling to deal with, particularly in context of some design limitations, misdeclared, improper stored dangerous goods, inadequately prepared port facilities, port of refuse, and firefighting. We will then discuss challenges of responding to today's fuel oils, that is VLSFO and ULSFO, as well as current and future alternative fuels, for example, LNG, ammonia, methanol, etc. And lastly, given the panel's expertise we will discuss what does good environmental performance looks like, and what are the strategic and tactical considerations the industry should take to exceed stakeholders' expectations. I will now hand over to Darren, who will introduce one specific scenario, and I will then follow on. Darren, over to you.
Thank you, Captain. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And first of all, I'd like to say thank you to MPA for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion. At OSRL, we're great supporters of ICOPCE and believe it's a good opportunity to discuss and debate the evolving issues. So the next few slides I'm going to share with you kind of highlight a number of the evolving issues, and that may be specific to the container shipping industry or the broader shipping industry. I'm not really going to provide answers to these issues, but really set the scene for what are the evolving issues and give some examples of past events, and it gives us an opportunity to think about if those events happened again with the evolving issues, what would we do and what are some challenges we face. So first of all, the first point here I guess speaks for itself. Larger ships hold more bunkers, increasing worst case scenario oil spills. So with vessels now holding in excess of 16,000 cubic meters of fuel oil, there of course is a possibility for increased risk. However, it should be said that risk as a factor of probability and severity isn't necessarily increased just because you increase the volume of oil. And it is a positive note that the shipping industry has greatly reduced the probability of spills over recent years with better design of ships, crew training, regulation, navigational aids, etc. However, that doesn't take away the factor that if you simply have more oil on board the ship, you have an increase in the worst case scenario, the most credible worst case scenario. And therefore, owner-operators have to consider if they change their ships, if they enhance their ships, do they go for these new ships which have different oil or greater volumes? How does that change their risk profile? Are they still prepared? What could the impacts be? So it's a question to ask yourself as an owner-operator. Second point, so larger capacity for containers increases potential for greater volume and range of dangerous goods. Obviously, with the mega container vessels now carrying around 24,000 TEU of containers, there is this increased opportunity for, as I say, greater volume of dangerous goods, but obviously a greater range and mixing. And really with any incident that involves the spillage of chemicals or dangerous goods from a container vessel, one thing's for sure is there's a level of uncertainty. There is a huge permutation of outcomes that could happen, from mixing of chemicals mixing with oil, chemicals reacting when they come into the contact with the sea or the ship itself. And therefore, any event that includes the release of dangerous goods, chemicals, is complex. And with the bigger ships, we need to think again, how does that change the risk? Are we still prepared? What would the impacts be? The next point, greater demand for plastic continues to increase the shipment of feedstock. So in 2019, there was nearly 400 million tons of plastics produced globally, which means there's going to be an increase of the feedstock, and much of that feedstock is transported by the shipping industry. These little plastic pellets that we call nurdles. And in today's world, you spill anything from your ship, whether it's oil, chemical, or plastics, there's an expectation that it needs to be effectively cleaned up. Therefore, we need to be prepared for that. And I will talk more in a moment about plastics. As Captain mentioned just a moment ago, increased frequency of extreme weather events. With the unwelcome reality of global warming, we not only see the increased frequency, but the increase in the violence of these weather events, increased energy that they can emit. And since humans have been first navigating the seas, we've all been very aware of the challenges of storms and wind that present a hazard to shipping. Wider range of fuel oils, each requiring a different blend of spill response techniques. So of course with IMO 2020, which saw the introduction of low sulfur, ultra low sulfur fuel oils, there is now a different set of fuel oils available on the market. The traditional oils of course are still there. Ships that are operating with scrubbers still use these higher sulfur fuel oils. So we have a new range of fuel oils that we need to be prepared for to be able to respond to. And they give us different challenges. It's still an oil, still use the same techniques, but you need a different blend, but also need to understand what are the potential impacts of these different oils. So again, as an owner-operator, does everyone understand the challenges of converting over to a low sulfur fuel, ultra low sulfur fuel, in terms of its potential environmental impact and the challenges of cleaning it up? Growing use of the Northern Sea route. I guess that's a more broader context of, with global warming again, the Arctic areas are becoming more accessible and accessible for longer. And therefore we're seeing an increased volume of shipping activity in these regions, potentially bringing vessels in closer contact to highly sensitive environments. So again, what does that mean as an owner-operator responsible for incidents that happen from the vessel? How prepared are we for when the inevitable may happen, which is, oil spills? We put a lot of effort into prevention, but we need to be prepared when it happens. So are we ready for that? And the last point, a simple one, but growing amounts of shoreline litter. I'm sure like many people my age, we've seen the change in our shorelines, and it's an unfortunate one, that an increased amount of plastic and other debris that covers our shoreline today. And any oil spill that eventually impacts the shoreline, that greatly increases the problems with waste management. Therefore, it's not just oil and oil sediment you're dealing with, but much larger quantities of plastic and other litter that's washed up on the shoreline that becomes contaminated waste and really increases the problems associated with waste management. Nurdles, I said I'd come back to plastics. So of course there is this greater demand for plastics globally, and these little plastic pellets that are called nurdles are of course transported by ships around the world. And again, prevention is better than cure. There are ways to reduce the probability of losing nurdles from a ship, but we do need to also plan for if the spill happens. And these things are damaging to the environment. They might seem relatively inert, but they do get consumed by marine animals and seabirds, and therefore they pose a hazard, not just to the animals, but they pollute the shorelines. And these plastics also attract other marine pollutants that adhere to the surface. And as we know, plastics degrade very slowly. So these pellets, as you get photo-oxidization that occurs with them, they just break down and become microplastics. So as a shipping industry, of course, we need to be prepared. Spills, unfortunately, will happen occasionally, and therefore there needs to be processes, methods, plans in place to be able to deal with these plastics that wash up on the shoreline. Just a few examples now, and really just to highlight some of the points that I made. These are obviously historical incidents, but it's an opportunity to think about, with these evolving challenges, if these spills happened again, what would be different? How would we deal with it? So the first one, MSC Tritcher, over 400 tons of bunker oil spilt. It was carrying 31 containers of declared dangerous goods, a number of which had fallen into the sea. One particular container accidentally got broken in the salvage operation, which released around 2,000 plus canisters of aluminium phosphide, both some into the sea and some into the hold of the ship. And aluminium phosphide mixing with water, which of course is a high opportunity there with it spilling into the sea, produces phosphine gas. So these are the challenges not only for the responders but also for the salvors. And you can see a picture there in the bottom right of some canisters washed up in the shoreline, but also mixed with the fuel oil that was built from the vessel. So some of the challenges associated with dangerous goods. A bit closer to home, APL Denver. Luckily there was no containers or cargo over the side. But this is an incident, again, relatively small oil spill, approximately 300 cubic meters, but it's a heavy viscous oil. Here in Singapore, we've got relatively high temperature. It's not too much of an issue, but it is still viscous, and it limits some of the opportunities that you have for cleaning up the oil. If that had been in a colder environment, it would have been more difficult because the oil would be more viscous and more challenging. But it did impact some of the aquaculture around, and therefore that presented some different challenges for cleaning that up, not just from the shoreline or from the open sea, but from the aquaculture that was contaminated. And in New Zealand, the MV Rena, again, similar size of oil spill, 100, 350 tons, happened further offshore, which a greater opportunity for the oil to move and spread out, so it impacted a greater amount of shoreline. Again, a number of containers with hazardous materials. Obviously, oil can impact the shoreline. It moves with the ocean, with the wind and the waves and the currents, and therefore you can do some work to predict where it's going, but you can't really control it. And this impacted some culturally important indigenous sites. There was a sizable wildlife impact, so important seabirds and other animals. And I guess a positive, there was a really good response from volunteers to help clean up the shoreline, but that also introduces challenges in terms of an incident management. It's great to have volunteers come forward and help clean up, but how do you manage that? How do you ensure the health and safety of the volunteers? How do you coordinate them on the shoreline? How do you ensure that they've got the correct gear? And even doing the correct activity, because of course people that aren't trained or aren't being supervised could unfortunately do more damage than good if they're not supervised or know what they're doing. And then lastly, SSL Calcutta. This was an explosion that happened in a container, led to a fire, the vessel was abandoned and eventually ran aground. Rough seas, strong winds hampered the salvage and response efforts. It was relatively close to a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Luckily, there wasn't really much oil spilt into the water, so from a responder's perspective, it was standing by, supporting the salvors. But shallow water, of course, because the vessel ran aground, did limit vessel suitability. But there was also other issues around what we call vessel of opportunity for conducting offshore oil spill response operations, containment and recovery. Some of the suitability the vessels offered in terms of health and safety wasn't appropriate. So therefore, some challenges in selecting the right equipment and support that you get locally to be able to undertake the operations safely and effectively. So hopefully that's just set some of the evolving challenges, a few examples of historical incidents, and that gives an opportunity to people to think about what does that mean going forwards, opportunities for some questions from the audience. And now I hand back over to Captain. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. Well, dealing with oil and chemical spills can be far more complex. And from ship owners and their insurers' point of view, and those familiar with this territory know very well that a web of convention and protocols, statutes, and schemes, and the ever-changing framework of environmental laws and regulation makes the task of dealing with oil chemical spills really very complex. The existing principal international law and regulation governing oil chemical pollution has got a big list, but the first and foremost, of course, is the United Nations Convention on the Laws of the Sea. Then there are, if you can see on their slides, they are like CLC, the Fund Convention, MARPOL, you have OPRC, HNS, IMDG, IBC, London Salvage Convention, wreck removal, etc. And then beside that, there are some important domestic legislation, like for Arctic, he was just talking about Northern Sea Route. So you have the Arctic Shipping Safety and Pollution Prevention Regulation. Then there is OSPAR Commission for Northeast Atlantic, US OPA, of course. And then additionally, there is Merchant Shipping Act, actually, where these conventions are not enacted. They have their own Merchant Shipping Act, like for Singapore, India. For China, you have China Maritime Safety Agency and ISPRO. I will just skip through these slides because I think I'm now running short of time. My friend Darren took a little longer than yes. So there are international compensation regimes, so you can ask this question later if you wish. But I will just quickly go to straight to my next slides, that is P&I claims actually. So as to the admissible claims or the P&I claims, this was the topic for my short presentation. A media sensitization, of course, this is one of the challenges that the insurers are facing now. And you expect journalists and news crew to come from all over the world if the casualty has a televisual impact. And mistaken public perception of the nature and extent of the pollution damage have often had a significant bearing on the economic consequences of spill. And sometimes they appear to have influenced the nature and scale of the response operations, which later Darren would talk about actually. Legal issues then may arise as to extra loss and expenses not directly caused from the contamination from the spill. It now turns out that Mauritius claims for damages caused by last year, August 2020 oil spill could far exceed the limitation value. Because of the nature of the Wakasi oil spill and the way the response was handled, it could become a landmark environmental test case that could change international shipping and environmental law. And particularly, the Arctic nations are very much interested in the outcome from the Mauritius oil spill, as the International Maritime Organization is currently reviewing pollution laws around heavy fuel oil in environmentally sensitive areas such as the Arctic, particularly after the following strong criticism of the international shipping regulator. At the heart of the case is whether a particular international ship pollution law, known as the 2001 Bunker Fuel Convention, could lead to strict liability with unlimited limitation. This needs to be tested. Given the nature of the strict liability system of compensation regime, there are very limited scope for dispute as to liability for the spill. In practice, given the policy consideration, compensation has nearly always been available for payment of claims. As to claims, they fall into four main legal categories. The number one is cleanup operation and other preventive measures. So under the convention, the compensation is payable for the cost of reasonable measures taken by any person to prevent or minimize pollution damage. The second category is the physical damage, that is direct physical damage to property owned by the claimant. That could be movable property, say for example, fishing gear, fishing nets, and fishing boats, damage to fish farms, and aquaculture stocks, other pleasure craft, etc. And immovable property includes private beaches, piers and embankment, and importantly, industrial installation, etc., where we are seeing now a bigger claim coming from actually. Now the economic losses part is, the third category is quite painful for the insurer, which are the direct result of pollution damage. This is concerned with financial losses such as reduction in profits or earnings sustained by claimants as a result of marine casualty. Again, most common claims are fishing, aquaculture, and related industries, reduced catches, loss of earning due to suspension of harvesting, reduced sales or prices due to loss of public confidence in the quality of produce, and this could be really, really expensive claim. Other typical claim includes owners of hotels, restaurants, and other tourist establishments for loss of booking and trade. And claim related to ports and shipping could be losses resulting from delay and interruptions, losses resulting from diversion of shipping, basic reduction of business from the ferry operator, that could be also one of the claim element. And the fourth category of claim is the environmental reinstatement and restoration. And that is sometimes could be a really, really expensive claim, particularly for the increased public awareness. In practice, the claims have taken numerous forms and have raised actually many issues involving difficult questions of principle and law, which is beyond the discussion of this particular forum. Now, under the HNS Convention, which is not yet into force actually, the scope of damage is much wider. Here, the claim expressly includes loss of life or personal injury on board or outside the ship. And there is no requirement of contamination, unlike CLC. As to possible defense to claims, very limited. Act of God or act of war or natural phenomenon of an exceptional, inevitable, and irresistible character. The deliberate act of a third party, say sabotage or terrorism, or when it is wholly caused by the negligence or wrongful act of government or other authorities who are responsible for maintaining those equipment or navigational aids. For example, an authority cannot claim on the limitation fund if the pollution was caused by their failure to maintain navigational aids. These are some of the typical salvage contract form which are used actually by salvors and the stakeholders. The most effective preventive measures are usually those which avoid or minimize escape of oil from the ship, and professional salvors provide the first line of defense in the protection of the environment against pollution from marine casualty. Salvors award normally, in past they have used LOF form very frequently, but that has now declined. And as the statistics show, it was 255 LOF contract awarded in 1980, but now it has come down to 37 in 2014, and 2018 it went marginally up to some 40 odd figures. And the owners and their insurers, they often prefer the commercial contract, for example, wreck hire, wreck fixed, etc., or the LOF with side letter, which can cap or regulate the Article 13 award. As to cleanup operation concern, the LOF form is not suited for the spill response, and there is a separate contract for that is called a response con, and that is a fairly balanced contract, I would say, actually, to all concerned parties. Coming to pandemic-induced ramification on contractual performance. Now, various countries have implemented a regime of pandemic-related lockdown measures. Now, there are many countries where the restrictions lifted and then reinstated due to heavily infectious strain of the COVID-19. We are all aware of that. In some countries, there are different level of restriction, lockdown in different parts, province of the country. So the COVID situation has been changing very fast, and the information sometimes not really readily available to the stakeholders. And with daily changes in the legal and regulatory landscape, as government enacts outbreak management measures, inevitably, many parties are finding it increasingly difficult to fulfill contractual obligations. It is unlikely that the pandemic itself will have had immediate ramification on contractual performance. It is the knock-on effect which will be an issue and which does give rise to a question of coercion and the potential disputes. Unlike in a sale contract or charter party where we see regularly the pandemic-related issues, insofar we have not seen any ramification on the contractual performance under the salvage contract. Some of the potential dispute related to liability, delays, extra cost, expenses that can include, what I can think of is like, say for example, delay in mobilization, demobilization of assets, which happened during the pandemic time. Significant delay in obtaining necessary permit and license, then the issue would arise as to who is responsible. Sickness, death of personnel, causing a spread of highly infectious disease, and then delay due to travel, quarantine, testing, etc. And then response personnel sometimes not willing to travel due to COVID, because he has to also think of his own safety. So there are provisions in the standard salvage form contracts which are subject to reasonableness of the parties. Now, the reasonableness, this word is actually fertile ground for lawyers and the people who are interested in dispute. Whether the non-performance, delay, loss was due to the circumstances beyond parties' control, and that needs to be considered. And although COVID-19, its recurrence and its mutations are foreseeable, careful review of the protective provisions in the contract should be taken by the parties. I would ask my colleague here, who is a salvage expert, have you seen any this kind of contractual issues, Bas?
Yeah, I think there is definitely some discussion on some of the elements, especially on what you can foresee a longer running operation, where you need to think of a crew change for our team or the resources that we engage. And in those particular instances, you now need to consider pre-quarantine arrangements, pre-travel arrangements, but also on the return quarantine arrangements. And if you have a team of 10, 15, sometimes 40 people, that's a significant amount of money that you are talking about of isolating these people for a long period of time. And you have to keep the operation running as well. So that is definitely something, a discussion point that we see in contractual discussions.
Thank you. Yes, that's right. So the salvage, the contract has to be now, basically consider all these factors before the parties agree. Well, with this, I will end my presentation, and then we will now move on to our panel discussion. And since we have got such a esteemed panelists, and this is going to be a fantastic panel discussion, we would start with a pre-event survey response, actually. And let's see what we see here, what the participants have said. Well, thank you, participant. I think this question is very relevant. What is the most significant challenge facing the industry now as a result of increased public awareness on marine environment protection? Yes, we are seeing this problem very often, what this can do, and we will be further discussing during our panel discussion. So as I can see here, so the waste management is, I can see, the most challenging part here, followed by its media management, and closely followed by stakeholders management, and then there is a spill management, and finally no significant challenge. I think coming to the stakeholders management, I can briefly comment. I totally agree with this survey, actually. Thank you very much for giving a very realistic survey result. Because my own experience dealing with marine pollution is, when emotion created by images of wildlife, coated with black oil, and Darren just showed some of those beaches where you saw those plastic pellets, sprayed around. Now, this really makes the task of the stakeholders very challenging. And public expectation, of intense response activities, it influences the nature and scale of the measures taken by the various authorities, like the government authorities and other stakeholders, like oil company and all. So this does really create a big problem. And I can tell you from the insurance and the legal point of view, like when such parties, after incurring those costs, when they look to the insurer for their compensation, then the question arises where the cost or the measure taken, was it reasonable? Particularly when the expert advise, that the measure taken were technically inappropriate, or predictably it was ineffective. Then there is a issue here, like who's going to pay? Was it really needed, or was it really extra cost? Is this one of the covered perils, or the liability side is part of the P&I rules book? And this unfounded fears of possible hazard really sometimes creates a big problem. I can give you my own take on this here. Once I was dealing with a oil pollution case, and I was on site for investigation. And later that evening, I, along with my insurer clients, actually, we went to a restaurant for eating, and we ordered some seafood. And I was told no seafood in the entire city. This was a very big city, though. And I was really surprised. And they said that they have also destroyed even the seafood that was imported from the other city because there was a big public protest. And this all can really cause a really huge consequences as far as the economic consideration concerned. Now, as to the response side, I have seen here the public expectation is really quite high. They do not want to see any oil to reach to the shore, the spill to reach to the shore, or even something is there, they want this to be clean as if there is absolutely no trace. And sometimes it could be technically very challenging. Darren, what is your take on this?
Yes, I completely agree, and we've experienced similar challenges in the past. I think the public don't always appreciate the challenges of when we're talking about oil spills, cleaning up oil spills, how difficult it is to implement the scale in which the oil may spread on the surface, and the limitations of the options that are available. And public often want to see visually something happening. So therefore, there are options like spraying dispersants or actually assisting natural degradation, monitoring and evaluate, where people physically want to see things being done. So putting out booms on the shoreline, containing and recovering oil offshore, which are all appropriate strategies, but they have limitations, especially when it comes down to weather. Shoreline booms, renowned for failing in strong seas and winds. And again, offshore containment recovery. At best, it's typically 15% of the oil you will collect, even with a really effective offshore containment recovery strategy. Therefore, when you get this public and media pressure to do more, sometimes that influences politicians or other people to say, we want this done, when it's not always the most appropriate option.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you, participants. This was really a very relevant question. We will now move on to actually our panel discussion. And we have seen that industry is still struggling with, as far as the shipping-related incident concern, is mega containers, basically the fire cases. We have seen so many cases in the recent past. And we have to also accept the fact these mega ships are going to stay. They are not going to disappear. They are there for a region cost optimization. So Captain Peter, I think you are one of the largest ship manager, and sorry, I'm just trying to highlight one question here. And since I just want to have your take on this actually, like why the shipping industry, which is so sophisticated and well regulated, is still struggling with the mega box ship fire, which is threatening the lives of the crew and risking significant damage to environment, besides actually causing huge economic consequences for the stakeholder.
Yeah, thank you, Captain Dubey. First of all, I'd like to thank the MPA and ICOPCE for this platform that you've given us. I think it's very important for us to engage and to understand the requirements by stakeholders. And you mentioned stakeholders within the shipping industry or the container industry. There's so many stakeholders involved, from owners, charterers, shippers, freight forwarders, and it is a humongous channel of supply chain which we have to manage on a day-to-day basis. And it's always been told that the captain on board a container ship is always having this struggle of knowing what cargo is loading as opposed to a tanker or a bulk carrier. I'm sure all of us, the panelists here, will agree with me. So the challenges are still there. As you can see from the slide which I'm showing, for the last 10 to 15 years, the last decade, the growth of the size of the container vessels from 8,000 TEU to latest where it gone up to 3 times the size of 24,000 TEU. But you don't see the rules and regulations change with the size of their vessels change. So it doesn't keep in par, and there's a lot of dichotomy between the vessels change in size the last 10 to 15 years and the rules of SOLAS. So that's where the biggest challenge we face, and I would say the main challenge is with the ship staff and the concerns that we have on board when we see such fires, and how do we manage that, and especially with the latest Express Pearl, which we all know, which just happened at our doorstep in the Indian Ocean. The most recent case, Maersk Honam in 2019, and the Hyundai Fortune in 2006. One of the main issues that we face, Captain Dubey, I would say, and I'm sure that all the panelists will agree with me, is that the frequency where the incidents has happened. One of the highlights I put there, on average, there's been roughly 1 fire every 2 weeks in 2020, with a major container fire occurring on average of every 60 days. 9 major container ships fire were reported in 2019. And, despite an overall fall in casualties in the first half of 2020, 10 such incidents were reported. And one of the most important point is things like cargo-related fires, especially in self-heating charcoal. Second is in the areas of various kinds of dangerous chemicals, IMDG, undeclared cargoes. And third is batteries itself. It's indicated here about, from studies, 10% of the laden containers, or 5.4 million containers being shipped annually, are estimated to contain undeclared dangerous goods. Yeah, major incidents like fires on the Maersk Honam and the Yantian Express have shown crew are often not able to respond quickly, because by the time they come to understand there is a fire, it's too late. And God forbid, you should have this fire at sea. I myself, through my experience, have had experience 6 years ago in port. And the saddest part, we spoke about things like the ability to manage waste, the ability for ports to be ready to help ship staff. We don't see that. We don't see that. So one of the biggest concerns today is governments, are they ready? Are they ready to manage such fires? And we have, Darren, you can actually touch on the Basel Convention. When we had that issue, we couldn't remove the waste generated on board. So it took us a long time to actually remove that. So these are the practical problems that we are facing. And the last point, fire and smoke detectors are typically too slow to react to the fires in the cargo hold. And by the time it's detected, it's too late. The most important point is here, which I'd like to reiterate, is the misdeclared cargoes and such dangerous goods, which makes it impossible, especially on the supply chain. And we talked about later on, can we hold people accountable for such, deliberate, I would say, even knowing what they are doing. And I myself, in this case, where it was 6 years ago, experienced this toys being declared in a certain container, but it was filled with IMDG aerosols, right? And we had July the 4th on board when you had the aerosols go off. So can you imagine toys being declared because of certain shippers wanting to pay less insurance or less cost of freight, and it endangers the ship staff on board. And like I said, it was just divine privilege that we had this ashore, which we could get timely response. But imagine if this was at sea. Yeah. So the NCB study, which was the 2020 study last year, mentions here that of 500 containers inspected, 55% failed with one or more deficiencies, right, containing dangerous good. And these are the concerns that we are facing. These are the concerns with wrong labels, undeclared goods, undeclared weights, right? And this is the main concern that the ship staff are facing today. The limitations on board, like I mentioned earlier, with the size of the ship, the last 1 or 2 decades, you can see from the 8,000 TEU to 3 times the size. But you can see this case of the MSC ship amendments for firefighting, which only comes in place from 1st January 2016, and for ships built after that. But what happens for vessels built before that with similar size ships? So that's where we see the disparity between what SOLA says and how we are going to manage on board. During this similar case, when I experienced myself 6 years ago, the beam of the ship became so wide that you couldn't actually have, when we had this accommodation issues or fires, from one end to the other end, the hoses lengths were not taking into consideration, right? So and till today, as you can, I think many of you all who serve on container vessels, we still have only 2 breathing, I would say, fireman outfits and 2 breathing apparatus, which is allowed by SOLAS, and 2 more for IMDG. So on a vessel of 350 meters long, how do you fight a fire or a standby guy with just 2 breathing apparatus and 2 firemen suits? So it's not feasible, where requirements are not in line with the size of the ship. So we have to seriously look at how the industry and the stakeholders not just look at carrying capacity and trying to, fill up the vessels, but you have to understand that on every vessel is not just a crew list, but a life on board, which we have to bring back home safely. So these are some of the points that we ourselves have brought together, some of the practical measures that we, from BSM, 5 years ago, we started, after my incident, we started this DNV-GL container committee for large ships initiated in Singapore, which I chair. And some of the points we're working with class on certain of these points, and that's when the 2016 was initiated. We had another incident in one of the ports of lithium ion battery packed and declared as leather bags, declared as leather bags in the declaration, but it was actually lithium battery, and it started to smoke in the cargo hold. And by the time it started to smoke, the detectors, as you know, it's located higher up in the cargo hold, was too late. So we managed to divert the ship quickly. And when I experienced 5 years ago, the waste management from this particular jurisdiction was so particular that I could not even put water in the containers to try to, they didn't want any water from my ship to leak into the port, and they wanted us to collect all this water. But you can see here, in this particular port, how they extinguished the container was just put the container into the water. So different jurisdictions, different requirements, and that was their solution to a smoking container. You can laugh at that if you all want. Yeah. So this is after how the batteries and in the bags which were undeclared, and the photographs. So we were very fortunate. The ship was very close to port. We managed to divert in time and get the required support and help. But the problem is, again, the shore staff who came on board came with just normal shoes and slippers, right? No PPE, and they're not ready for these kind of fires. But they like what I said in my last. That's how they addressed it. Took it with a floating crane and dumped it into the water. Yeah, some people might be sensitive with this photograph, but that's the reality of it. Yeah, on waste management. Yeah. So I know I'm being a bit long, Captain Dubey, but I think these are the factors that we have to face, and the limited shock capabilities, like I mentioned, we see underpowered tugs, the case we had recently, and the firefighting capabilities ashore, and the ability for shore to be able to support any fires on board. And like the point which I made, seawater is used for every fire on board, right? That's the easiest. But you know what happens with certain chemical reactions, when especially you have IMDG on board, that's the last thing you want to put, seawater. Thank you. Yeah, over to you, Captain Dubey. Yeah.
Thank you, Captain Peter. This was really, really very helpful. And in fact, in a way, you have summarized the whole container ship related issues. So even when I go to you for next question from the audience, probably you have already answered part.
Yes, yes.
But thank you very much indeed. Well, so the next question here is, the industry has witnessed, and there is a growing concern that I'm stuck with container ship. So there's a growing concern that mega container ships will have catastrophic impact in the event of large-scale casualty that includes fire. And add this to ongoing pandemic. What challenges are faced by the salvors and the professional firefighters in dealing with such emergency response situation? I think Bas Wiebe will be the right person to answer this question.
Yeah, thank you, Captain Dubey. I think this is a important question. There are a lot of concerns, and I think if you look at a salvage response, there are a lot of elements that come together. I think in what was discussed by my fellow panel members and the concerns that there are, yeah, all these elements we need to focus on, and basically it is obtaining a lot of information at the outset of an incident. That is really important. But if you indeed have a 24,000 TEU vessel and you ask for the manifest, you will get it together with a bay plan. But it doesn't really mean that you will be able to identify all the hazards that are basically there. You need to understand the location of the fire. Actually, the DG listed cargo is oftentimes provided very quickly, and because that is considered dangerous and that can be dealt with. But the indeed misdeclared or brand names of specific cargoes might not be familiar, and the interaction between benign cargoes might be in concern. It is correct to say that the first solution or the option that is available to the crew, but also salvors, is cooling, spraying water, and that will accumulate in cargo holds. When it accumulates in cargo holds, there are a couple of issues that will follow. The debris from the fire will limit the vessel's pumping capability to discharge it, to keep stability. But also, once it's in the vessel itself, it might not be allowed to be pumped out, indeed, based on the jurisdiction that you are in. And especially in a tropical climate, what we find ourselves here in, of course, all along the equator, I guess, the main shipping routes, is that it will start decomposing organic materials. And that forms H2S, which will create, and that goes very quick. Within a week, this will start occurring. And getting to the cargo, finding a solution is then very difficult. And once you have a toxic environment, the operations will be further delayed. You have to have specialists, marine chemists, to deal with the situation as well. And all these things are coming together. So you then have to make decisions. Do you save certain amounts of cargo? Do you sacrifice cargo to maintain a stable ship? And what are your next steps? How do you get into a port with a situation like that? So there are many factors that are being considered in that particular moment in time, and close cooperation, what we find between owners, managers, cargo interest, but definitely also other stakeholders, is then very important.
Can I just add?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I think one of the main points, Bas, where we have seen on practical requirements is when you have a container ship fire and you have this mixture of IMDG, you have a mixture of other containers very close by, right? And then you have this like a cocktail mix, and the ship staff are not trained in what to expect, how to fight the fire, and I think that's where the biggest concern, because they don't have the proper PPE at the time. You can say it's cryogenics, it's it's H2S, and depending on the type of containers you're loading and the mixture of the. So when we address it, immediately, we inform the salvage companies to bring about the appropriate PPE, because most of the times the salvage company, what can the ship staff do? They only can do boundary cooling. They can do spray curtains to avoid the fire from spreading to the accommodation. So that's the only thing they can do, and then go to a safe place until you get professional help, right? So that's the immediate actions they can do, and this is from practical experience that we have faced, right? Again, and then divert to the nearest port if you can to seek refuge. But we see in the case of the Express Pearl that became a concern, right? To get a port of refuge, to get because that's where what happens is a lot of governments and jurisdictions, they, because of the lack of awareness and the fear of what's going to happen, pollution in my territory, they say no, not here. Please take your problem somewhere else.
Maybe I can add a quick note on port of refuge.
Yeah.
Because I think the interest of the respective stakeholders are not always aligned. There are, from a manager, owner's point of view, commercial pressures. There's an information available. But from an authority's point of view, I would say there's safety, security, and the environment as the key drivers. Frankly, they're not necessarily interested in the ship or the cargo, to say it bluntly. But I think if we can, let's say, marry the two and say, well, where we have common interest, and we say, well, if we come in, we will make sure that there are sufficient contingencies in place. Then together we make a plan, and then hopefully there's an understanding that will accommodate a vessel import. And particularly, I would say in Singapore, MPA is very mindful of this. Other jurisdictions are maybe somewhat less developed, and then it's a very big challenge.
Yeah. So just to add, before Captain Dubey, we had in this particular port, we had a chemical reaction with styrene monomer, and what happened was trying to create awareness with a particular port. If you can get inhibitor in time, you can actually stop the chemical reaction. Yeah. So they stopped us from giving the inhibitor in time until I had to go ashore, explain to these authorities, because there's a time frame for you to get the inhibitor because of the lapse, and then that will create chemical reaction. So they listened to us. Then finally we managed to get it in time. Yeah. So, but this is where I think experts has to be built up together with PNI, chemical experts, pollution experts, and then bringing about awareness when there is a certain incident. And I'm sure governments will listen. In this case, they did.
This is also quite a political, actually, issue, the port of refuge. And also you have to consider the port facility in terms of even draft restrictions, whether the ship can go there. And the identification of port itself is an issue. Once you identify whether the port will accept you, that is an issue.
Yes.
Third, whether you can reach there. Before that only, you don't know what is going to happen. So there are so many issues. And now in terms of, since I come from PNI background, I can tell you from my point of view, like, yes, the insurers are normally now willing to provide security to the reasonable amount of security to, because they sometimes demand really very high security. You are bringing a ship which is on fire, the consequences could be simply, devastating. So that also causes some delay and decision-making process issues and all. Yeah, but thank you very much. That was really very enlightening, Boss Vivi and Captain Peter. Well, now we have a question from audience. So I'm going to the audience question, and it is really very relevant to our topic, actually. So the question is, we will be seeing ship increasing the use of alternative fuel in near future. Yes, we discussed that in our presentation, like LNG, LPG, biofuel, etc. Has the oil spill, chemical response industry studied the possible impact of this fuel onto the marine environment? What need to be done by the industry to prepare themselves to contain the impact of these fuels? This comes from Mr. Elfian Haroon, Intertanko. Thank you very much for asking such interesting and relevant question. I think, Darren, probably you can address this.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a really good question as well. I think today we're still further understanding the challenges with low sulfur fuels, ultra low sulfur fuels, very low sulfur fuels, etc. Unlike traditional marine fuels, so if I take an IFO 180, different suppliers will supply it and it will have similar physical chemical properties, where these new ultra low sulfur fuels, very low sulfur fuels, fuels that come from different suppliers, they have different proprietary recipes, and therefore there is a broad range of chemical physical properties of these, so they don't all act the same. And that's quite a challenge. And it's actually difficult to get information, because it is proprietary recipes, on what's included in them and what are the properties. So we're trying to work with manufacturers today to obtain samples. It would have been done by now, but it's delayed by COVID. But to attain some samples and do some testing on different equipments to look at how effective some different response strategies and equipment would be against these low sulfur, ultra low sulfur fuels. I guess if we move forward, I mean, out of these ones that have been posed in the question, LNG is already a fuel of today. We're actually working with the industry to address one of the challenges around LNG as a cargo, so not as a fuel, in terms of, you're not going to clean up a spill, because of course, it would quickly turn into a gas, change phase into a gas if it was spilled. But of course, there may be a need in an instant with a vessel to stabilise the asset and potentially lighter the LNG off. So it has been identified that there is limited capability to this, and certainly limited capability that you can have guaranteed access to in the event of an emergency. So we're actually working with stakeholders at the moment to potentially come up with a solution to provide that guaranteed access to LNG lightering capability. But that's more for LNG as a cargo. It's a different question as a fuel. And then as you move on to some of the fuels that are, of course, in early stages of potential fuels of the future, we don't know which ones are going to come forward as, the key players. But of course, I don't think there has been those studies done yet. And I think it's important for response organisations and industry and manufacturers to work together to do these studies, because traditionally it's all been oil. Yes, they're different and they have different properties, and you may need a different blend of strategies, but with the future fuels, ammonia, another gas, methanol, which is miscible in water, they're all very different. Some of them you will be able to do things with, others you won't, and therefore I think it is important that as the industry moves forwards, as some of these come out as, the key ones that they're going to take forward, what does that mean in terms of, in terms of salvage, in terms of lightering, in terms of response, spill response, etc. So it's a very good question.
Yeah. Do you also work with cooperation with other industries, like which can provide you some data here, or is it only related to shipping?
No, we work very closely actually with the oil and gas industry.
Right.
So we do have, and that's who we're working with at the moment.
But they will have much larger database for you to basically get information from.
Yeah.
Because before you see any major spill, you already have something in place.
There is. I mean, so there is databases of properties of oils, but not everything that's out there. And of course, it is specific to the operation. You can get properties of oil, but how's it going to be used? Where is it going to be used? What is the scenario? And that changes, again, what could be the outcome.
So the dispersants, etc., that you will use, is it going to be different for them, for those future fuel, or like?
Dispersants is very specific to oils. out of the future fuels, it's probably not going to be applicable to them, apart from, of course, biofuel oils, maybe.
Yes.
Dispersants have limitations in terms of, even with the oils today, which oils they work on, and the biggest resistance to dispersants being effective is the viscosity of the oil. So the heavier the oil, the more it resists the effects of dispersants. But in the right situation, dispersants are still a very effective strategy. But they have to be used responsibly. It's like anything. Dispersants is one option that you can use, but you have to go through a process to select the right response strategy, which we call NEBA, Net Environmental Benefit Analysis, to look at, what is the impact if you leave nature to recover naturally,
Yes.
and you weigh up the different response options, see which ones gives you the greatest benefit and the reduce harm to the environment, and then you choose the response options to which you take forward.
Just to add quickly, one of the main points that we've found, because we have a number of tankers and dry, when we had dry vessels with LNG or methanol, the crew training, again, I wanted to stress this because it's easier for a tanker person to convert to LNG and use that as a fuel because their risk assessment abilities are different. But when you put this kind of fuel onto dry ships, it takes, for bunkering, for operations, you have to have proper training, proper follow through. Please take this into account because with LNG, as you know, cryogenics is the dangers with that is very important to understand. So that's where the crew training is critical.
Actually, you have already answered one of the questions the
Oh,
audience
did
just
I say
asked.
that? Oh, I didn't know.
It was asked just by the audience. So, but you have already answered. Go on. Actually, it's related
Yeah.
to the crew training
Yeah.
in terms of when you respond actually this kind of future fuel spill.
Correct. Even for the fact of putting like spill dispersant. When I was sailing, that was the first thing we did. As a, we had this on board, but nowadays you can't just put items into the water. You need to get permission. You need to ask the local jurisdiction if you can do that. So that the environment concerns have changed so much. So I think it's very important how we train the crew. And I think in this context of the panel, what we did, I think we resolved, we managed to get them in the office. When we do drills, it's important that we do real life scenario drills with the ship staff. That forms part of the training.
I think that's very important.
And
yes.
that is very important. I think you all know a year ago when one of my vessels was hit by a limpet mine in the Gulf, right? And you know what saved the master was training. We trained him. We trained the whole full ship. They simulated an incident like that, and the next day it happened. So remember, training is important, not just training for the sake of training, but very specific training. It could be bunkering. It could be training to bring the ship into Middle East. It could be spill training. How do you manage spill? How do you manage even media response? We spoke about it today. The media is ruthless in certain jurisdictions. How do you train your master to stand before a camera? How do you train your management team? Right? That training is all important. So that there are a lot of the gambit of training is a lot, right? And then you need to really be in tune. And in today's context, every crew member has got a handphone. So when you have the first incident, remember his wife knows more than you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So radio silence is important. As much as you want to give everyone on board the ability to have social media, you need to have that in your policy, right? Your IT policy, your cybersecurity policy has to be very, very tight. Yeah.
No, true. Thank you. I'll go on to the next question now from the audience. It's anonymous, so I don't see name here. And the question is, in the event of a marine casualty, when a vessel is to be sunk, because you were just talking about the port of refuge and all, together with her cargoes, under the order of the government authorities, is there law saying that claims to be paid by various insurers? Well, that's really a very important question. And I think I can take this. So the answer is partly yes, because if you consider the hull policy, they do have a pollution hazard clause actually, which covers this kind of scenario. But of course, this is subject to a proviso that it should not be from the want of due diligence from the assured part actually. So as long as that clause is there. Probably the hull policy will provide you cover here. Now, as to the cargo policy, I'm not really very sure. I need to check what are the latest institute cargo clauses here. But I do understand that American cargo policies, they do often have this pollution hazard clause. So there it is covered for sure. I'm not sure about the institute cargo clause. I need to check. From the P&I point of view, yes, it is, since as long as it is owner's legal liability and subject to the P&I rules book, then probably it is covered. So I would say yes, it is mostly covered, except the cargo policy, which I'm not sure. I need to check. Thank you very much for asking this question. This is really a very relevant question, and this is really a big claim when the government authorities are telling, when they take the control of the ship, and they want to basically destroy the ship to minimize the environment or reduce the pollution.
Yeah, maybe I can add a little bit.
Absolutely, please. Go on, boss.
I think it's a bit of a hypothetical situation, of course, because normally you will find yourself in a situation where you don't have a port of refuge anymore, and the condition of the vessel and the cargo is in a very critical condition at that point in time. So the authorities that are maybe, or in which jurisdiction this would take place, might not clearly communicate that the vessel needs to be sunk, but basically leave it as the only conclusion. And by doing so, and let's say there's a sulfur involved, we would then try to mitigate a situation like that, minimize pollution if it's at all possible, and trying to apply to, trying to find still a port of refuge, but if that's really exhausted, look at the location where the impact is limited, and any resulting spill will be taken care of in conjunction, for instance, with OSRL. Because if a vessel is sunk at 1,000-meter water depth, and subsequently an authority suggests that the vessel need to be removed and a cargo, that becomes an extremely expensive operation as well. So it requires some thought in that process.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think the next question is actually, I think it's for you, boss, most likely. As is known, the timing remains the key in emergency response to a large-scale casualty. So what do you expect that the owners and other stakeholders, particularly the insurers, should do in order to avoid or reduce longer decision process? And the second part of this question is probably answering partly to the question, is diminishing LOF emergency response cases, involvement of additional layer, for example, salvage consultant, etc., and protected negotiated salvage contracts are today's reality, actually. So from the salver's perspective, what are the recommendations to minimize decision-making delay?
Yeah, I think a very good question, a very comprehensive question, of course. And I think a lot of components are already being addressed. I think especially training, I think, is a very important part. Drills, realistic drills, those need to be held, but with all stakeholders. So trading routes, ports that are being frequented, interact with the authorities, the availability of resources, but also with link back to the insurances. The decision process as to contracting a salvor, yes, dealing with the operational aspect on a salvage, technical aspects, but also the contractual aspects. So LOF, Lodge Open Forum, has been discussed as a contract. Yeah, it's very infrequently used and so very unknown and not very much loved. But there are some benefits to it in certain circumstances. Times and material contracts that I work on a daily basis, like a wreck hire. Yeah, those are appropriate contracts for other situations, but have their limitations as well. And I think this is something that when you work with it, and are aware of it, then you know the pros and cons of it. And I think that is very, very important to practice and train.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, I mean, I would encourage you all, if you have ships going into the US as an example, meet up with the US Coast Guard, especially if your vessels are calling Houston area. So I used to do this on a yearly basis when we could travel. About 2 years ago, we had an incident, and so I knew these people in the US Coast Guard, so I called them up for help. We had a incident on board the vessel, and the ship staff, like what I said earlier, because of training, they were able to handle the emergency very well. And we got a little bit of flack from the public opinion because the media was taking it the wrong way. But the US Coast Guard stepped in, they helped us, and then I was immediately called, summoned to come to Houston, and I thought, why? And finally, they awarded us with a Medal of Courage, right? Because everything worked on board the ship, and the ship staff, our superintendent, everybody did very well. And what could have been a negative became a positive. And the US Coast Guard themselves helped us through this. So that's how important networking, making sure stakeholder management is important.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think one of the elements that will come apparent in a training and a drill and an actual incident based on experience is that it takes so much effort and time and resources from your organization away. So for a ship ownership manager, you're busy. That's what I know. You run many vessels, and so when you have to deal with an emergency, which is an exceptional kind of situation, it draws a lot of attention to it, while still your other businesses continue.
Correct.
So being able at that point in time to know what to do and maybe delegate it outside the organization is very important. And you need to have a partner that you can trust in these circumstances. And historically, Salfors had a bit of a reputation, I dare to say. But with communication nowadays, everything is transparent.
Yeah.
So Salfors are almost like normal contractors, and are always open to dialogue and try to improve on these things. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Well, our next question is from James Tan, actually, again, audience, and OSRL. So the question is, do our panelists think that the shipping industry is well prepared for the next big incident? So I think it is for all of us to partly contribute here. And then what are some of the areas that the industry should work on to better manage such incident? I think probably you have already addressed some of this. But Captain Peter, do you want to add?
Yeah, maybe I can just add to James. Good question. We will never be ready, right? Because see, we all are in this panel here. We are risk managers, right? Even as a ship manager, we manage risk on a day-to-day basis. When we wake up and come into the morning into the office, we have a schedule. But I think I can speak for myself. We never keep to the schedule, right? So that's the day-to-day management of managing ships, owning ships, running vessels, and I can speak for everyone here. But the thing is, drills are very important to be prepared. We need to drill. We need to manage the stakeholders. We need to make sure that the proper training for our crew is important. We need to retain the crew once trained, and we have to make sure that the proper succession planning, even what happens from the ship to the office, it's important. The cultural gap to be maintained. I think the biggest concern today is making sure that people have adequate training and making sure you retain them, make sure you keep them within the industry, and that is important. And hopefully, when the next big incident comes, we are able to manage. But like I spoke, the soft skill, there's a soft issue, but also the hardware part, how we have to make sure that we get the stakeholders involved. Things like when I spoke about the container design, the cargo hold design, making sure that maybe detection system are more practical. So when you look at cargo carrying capacity and maximizing cargo carrying capacity, I think it's important to look at safety of carriage as one of the key criteria, working with class, working with the regulatory bodies to make sure that each of the requirements are practical and feasible to be maintained on board the vessel, taking into account that ship staff safety is important.
Yeah, thank you. What's your take, actually, Darren? What should be done?
Yeah, good question. I think the first part of that, which is the shipping industry ready? I think I refer to a point that was mentioned by a panelist on the first plenary of safety at sea, which is if you look at the global shipping industry, you have a collection of the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yes, true.
So, if the good, yes, well prepared, but there's plenty others that can do more, I think, without
But industry as a whole, you think they are well prepared to deal with?
As a whole, I think an area that, and it really echoes the points that Captain Peter said, is about risk.
Yes.
And I think as owner-operators of vessels, there is opportunity to better assess the risk that they have, to better assess the scenarios that may happen. As he said, exercises is so important, realistic exercises.
Yeah.
So those risk assessments are important. From a spill response, what's going to happen? Have we got access to the resources? Do we have access to the right resources? How are we going to manage the incident? Have we got an effective incident management team? And I think they are the key things,
Yes.
and more can be done in that area.
And where the stakeholders are actually really interested, for example, when there used to be so big oil spills in past, now that is almost to nil actually. And that happened due to a very strong regulatory regimes and also from the commercial stakeholders, like they started vetting properly. And a similar thing in bulk carrier losses, that is also has almost come down to very small number now. Same thing can happen to the container ship, those
Yes.
mega box, the fire and all. All right, so with this now, I will just ask one final question because I really don't have time now. Bas, probably I can ask you one small questions here, and this is going to be the last question. So we have got just about 3 minutes. Probably we can take one question here actually. Disappeared from here. All right, in terms of the SOLAS, you think the objective made, the fire safety? Now it's back to you, Captain Peter, actually.
Like I mentioned, the example I gave in for the 2016 requirements, and what came out from that was a lance and the spray system, but then it is not applicable for ships built before 2016. So at the same time, I gave the example of the breathing apparatus and the fireman's suit, which realistically, by SOLAS, we can meet the requirements, but if you have a fire on a vessel which is 300 meters long, and practically, even if you do a drill, how can you manage that, right? And can you imagine, we did a drill for trying to send somebody into the cargo to inspect, and again, it's not practical because the access to the cargoes are much longer, and the vessels are getting wider. Yeah, so it's deeper. So you have to make sure that these scenarios are played around, like what I said, drill scenarios are together with class and regulatory bodies, which are flag, which are so critical, right? And then that is important. Yeah. So we ourselves, owners and managers, cannot do this. It has to be holistic. It has to be everyone, and then maybe getting the feedback from people like yourselves, from actual scenarios which has happened and how we could have avoided it. So when we go through the investigation, the lessons learned, and making sure preventive and corrective actions are put in place.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, now I'm really running short of time, so probably we don't have much time left. A very quick one, if Darren, you can summarize what could be the strategic response to the large scale. You have got just 1 minute to answer this question.
So large-scale incidents, of course, as you mentioned, the numbers are reducing, which is a positive thing.
Yes.
And they happen infrequently. And I think the challenge is they can be forgotten. I go back to one of the points I made right at the beginning, which is, what is the most credible worst-case scenario? There is still probability that those incidents will happen. So although frequency of spills has reduced, although volume of oil spills has reduced, you still need to be prepared for the worst case.
Preparation is the key.
Absolutely, because it will happen. They'll be infrequent, but those worst cases, of course, are the most severe. So yeah, training and exercising, as was mentioned by Captain Peter, is so important. And in a pandemic, you have to be realistic about the challenges and build that into your training exercise plans. Be realistic about the real world around you. Realistic exercises involve the stakeholders. That's critical.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, with this, we'll have to end this part here, actually. And thank you very much, audience, for active participation and also asking some very, very interesting questions. They were just so relevant. I wish we had maybe 1 hour more to answer those questions, which are still listed on my iPad. But thank you very much indeed. This is extremely very useful discussion. And thank you to my panelists, actually. Each of you really contributed just so well.
Thank you.
And
Thank
really,
you.
thank you very much. Thank you to Fiona and the rest of the event team here. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, MPA. Thank you, ICOPCE.
Thank you, Captain Dube, Mr. Waterman, Captain Peter, and Mr. Weber for sharing your insights with us. This was a thought-provoking discussion which was able to address many of the questions that were asked by our audience online. This concludes Plenary 1 of the International Chemical and Oil Pollution Conference and Exhibition. Join us later this afternoon as our keynote speaker and panelists focus on navigating the increased complexity of incident management at 5 p.m. Singapore time. We would also like to get your views on today's session. We hope that you can take a few minutes to complete a feedback form, which will pop up later when you exit this webinar. And last but not least, you can take part in our quiz at the end of each session to win an Amazon gift voucher worth 50 Singapore dollars. To qualify, just scan the QR code or click on the link posted in the chat window. Answer all the questions correctly, and you could be one of the lucky winners randomly drawn per session. Winners will be notified via email, and if you're not based in Singapore, you will receive an equivalent in US dollar value for the Amazon gift voucher. So all the best and good luck. On that note, we would like to thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at Plenary 2 in an hour, which will be 5 p.m. Singapore time. Goodbye.